I stole from my struggling parents, but rebuilding their trust proved far harder than repaying the money. I can still remember the hollow sound of coins rattling in the old tin box, the one my parents kept hidden at the back of the pantry. It wasn't much, never was, but to them, it was everything. The sound of every coin that slipped through my fingers haunted me, even as I tried to convince myself that I had no other choice. My family wasn't just poor, we were struggling to keep the lights on, to put food on the table, to stay afloat in a world that seemed hell-bent on keeping us down. My father, a mechanic, spent long hours in a rundown garage, his hands forever stained with oil and grease. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families, coming home with barely enough energy to make dinner before collapsing into bed. And me? I was their only son, the one they believed could break the cycle of poverty, the one they had sacrificed so much for. But I had my own problems. I was drowning in debt, thanks to a series of bad decisions that started with a loan for college and spiraled out of control when I dropped out. I hadn't told them. I couldn't. My father had already taken out a second mortgage just to help me with tuition, and I knew if he found out I'd thrown it all away, it would crush him. So, one night, when the pressure became too much and the threats from creditors started coming in, I made a decision that would change everything. I stole from them. It wasn't a lot, just enough to keep the wolves at bay for another month. But as I stood in front of that tin box, my hands shaking, I knew there was no coming back from this. The guilt was immediate, heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I told myself I'd pay them back. I told myself it was a one-time thing. But deep down, I knew that once I crossed that line, there was no turning back. The next morning, my father came into the kitchen, his face weary but hopeful, like he always was before heading off to work. He kissed my mother on the cheek, then opened the pantry to grab his lunch. That's when I saw it, the moment he realized the money was gone. His hand froze, and for a split second, his face twisted in confusion, then panic. "Marie," he called out to my mom, his voice tight. "Did you take the money from the box?" My mother frowned, drying her hands on a dish towel as she walked over. "What are you talking about? I haven't touched it." I could feel the walls closing in on me. I kept my head down, pretending to be engrossed in my phone, but my heart was pounding in my ears. My father's hand trembled as he reached further into the box, searching for the money that wasn't there. "It's gone," he said quietly, turning to my mother. "All of it." The rest of that morning was a blur, my father's face etched with confusion, anger, and something worse, fear. My mother paced the kitchen, wringing her hands, going over every possible explanation for where the money could have gone. They never once looked at me. Why would they? I was their son, their pride, the one they had worked so hard for. The idea that I could be responsible was unthinkable. But as the minutes stretched into hours, I could see their hope unraveling, thread by thread. I stayed silent, my mind racing. They called the bank, neighbors, even asked a few friends if anyone had seen anything suspicious around the house. The idea that someone had broken in and stolen from us was a comforting lie they clung to, and I let them believe it. I had no choice. Admitting what I'd done wasn't an option. It wasn't just the money. It was the betrayal that would tear them apart. That evening, my father came home later than usual. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken with exhaustion and worry. He didn't say much, just collapsed into his chair and stared at the floor. My mother hovered nearby, not knowing what to say. I watched from the doorway, the guilt gnawing at my insides like a parasite. "How much was it?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. It was a pathetic attempt to feign ignorance, but I had to know how much damage I'd done. My father didn't look up. "All of it," he whispered. "Everything we had saved." My stomach dropped. I hadn't realized. I thought I'd only taken a portion, just enough to cover what I needed. But in my panic, I must have grabbed more than I realized. I felt like I was going to be sick. "They'll help us at the bank," my mother said softly, though her voice wavered with doubt. "We'll figure something out." But my father shook his head, the weight of years of struggle bearing down on him. "No," he said quietly. "That was our last safety net. We don't have anything left." The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation settling in like a thick fog. My parents had always lived on the edge, but they'd never been this close to losing everything. And it was my fault. I wanted to tell them the truth right then, to get it off my chest and beg for their forgiveness. But I couldn't do it. The shame was too much. So instead, I sat there, nodding along as my mother tried to comfort my father, offering empty reassurances that everything would be fine. But deep down, we all knew that wasn't true. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. The bills piled up, and the debt collectors started calling. My father worked longer hours at the garage, trying to make up for what was lost, but it was never enough. My mother picked up extra shifts, cleaning houses until her hands were raw and her back ached. Every night, they came home more exhausted than the day before, and every night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, consumed by guilt. The worst part was that I wasn't just lying to them, I was lying to myself. I told myself that I would pay them back as soon as I could, that this was all temporary. But the reality was, I had no way of making it right. I was stuck in a cycle of debt and deceit, and the hole I'd dug for myself was getting deeper by the day. One evening, my father came home looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. He didn't even make it to the table for dinner, just slumped into a chair in the living room and rubbed his temples. My mother, worried as always, came to sit by his side. "They cut my hours," he muttered, barely loud enough for me to hear. "Business has been slow." My mother's face fell. "What are we going to do?" "We'll figure it out," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. He was trying to be strong, but I could see the cracks forming. He was breaking, and it was all because of me. Later that night, after they had both gone to bed, I found myself standing in front of the old tin box again. It was empty now, just like the hope I had taken from them. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of my actions bearing down on me. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything to make the guilt go away. But nothing would change what I'd done. I couldn't undo the past. But maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to make things right. I didn't know how yet, but I had to try. I owed them that much. The pressure mounted as the days turned into weeks. The money was long gone, and the lie I had built to protect myself was slowly eroding. Every time my father came home with a little less hope in his eyes, I felt the weight of my guilt tighten its grip on me. My mother's optimism, once so constant, had begun to fade. They tried to hide it, but I could see the stress gnawing at them, dragging them down with every missed bill, every panicked glance at the empty pantry shelves. I couldn't stand it. Yet, every day that passed made it harder to confess. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. They would never look at me the same again. The fear of their disappointment was almost as unbearable as the guilt itself. I was trapped in my own silence, a prisoner of my own cowardice. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, my father broke the heavy quiet that had settled over us. "We need to talk about cutting back," he said, his voice firm but exhausted. "We can't keep going like this. There's not enough to get through the month." My mother nodded, her expression tight. "We'll manage. We always do." But I could hear the tremble in her voice, the doubt she was trying to hide. "Maybe if we sold the car," my father began, but my mother cut him off. "We need the car," she said sharply, then softened. "We'll figure something else out." I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed my plate away, barely touched, and stood up from the table. "I'm going for a walk," I muttered before they could say anything, grabbing my jacket and heading out the door. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, cold and biting. I shoved my hands in my pockets and walked aimlessly through the empty streets, trying to clear my head. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape the truth. The money was gone. I had taken it. And my family was paying the price. I found myself standing outside the convenience store on the corner. The same one I had passed countless times growing up, never giving it a second thought. But tonight, as I stood there, staring through the dirty windows, something clicked in my mind. It was desperate, reckless even, but I couldn't ignore the thought. Maybe, just maybe, I could fix this. I knew the store had been robbed before. It wasn't in the best part of town, and the owner wasn't exactly cautious with his cash register. I could see the till from where I stood, the owner distracted as he stocked shelves. It would be easy. A quick grab, just enough to cover what I had taken from my parents. I'd pay them back, and they'd never have to know. It was wrong, but it felt like the only option left. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I weighed the decision. Could I really go through with this? I had already stolen from my parents. What was one more step down this path? But as I stood there, on the brink of making another terrible choice, something inside me broke. I couldn't do it. I couldn't keep digging this hole any deeper. If I went through with this, I knew I'd lose myself completely. There would be no coming back. I turned away from the store, my heart pounding in my chest, and started walking again, faster this time, like I could outrun my own thoughts. By the time I got home, my legs ached, and I was out of breath. But something had shifted inside me. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I waited until both my parents had left for work. Then, I made a phone call that I should have made months ago. I called the debt collectors. I explained everything, the loans, the payments I had missed, the money I had stolen from my parents. It was humiliating, but I didn't care anymore. I was done hiding. I needed help, and this was the only way out. The man on the other end of the line was blunt, but not unkind. He told me there were options, but it wouldn't be easy. It would take time, and I'd have to come clean with my family eventually. But there was hope. When my parents came home that night, I felt the familiar wave of guilt wash over me as I sat at the dinner table, staring at my plate. But this time, I didn't run. I didn't make excuses. I was done lying. "Mom, Dad," I began, my voice shaking. "There's something I need to tell you." The silence after my confession stretched on for what felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms sweaty as I sat there, waiting for the inevitable explosion. My father was the first to react, though not in the way I expected. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He just looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, like he was trying to make sense of the words I had just said. You did what?" His voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the tremor of shock that ran through it. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "I took the money from the tin box," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was in debt, and I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could pay it back before you noticed, but then, things got worse." My mother's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes welling up with tears. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "We trusted you." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had prepared myself for anger, for disappointment, but nothing could have prepared me for the hurt in my mother's eyes. My father, on the other hand, seemed too stunned to speak. He just sat there, staring at me, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. "I'm so sorry," I continued, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me with every word. "I know I've let you down. I know I've betrayed your trust, but I'm trying to make it right. I've already contacted the debt collectors. I'm going to fix this." "How could you lie to us like this?" my father finally said, his voice hoarse. "We've sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us? By stealing from your own family?" "I didn't want to," I said, my voice rising in desperation. I didn't know what else to do. I was drowning in debt, and I was too ashamed to ask for help. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I couldn't. I messed up. I know that. Drowning in debt? My father's face darkened, the shock quickly giving way to anger. "Why didn't you come to us sooner? We could have helped you. But instead, you chose to steal from us, your own parents. How do you expect us to trust you after this?" My mother sobbed quietly beside him, tears streaming down her face as she buried her head in her hands. Seeing her like that, broken, hurt, it was unbearable. I had always imagined my confession would bring some sort of relief, like the truth would set me free. But instead, it only seemed to deepen the chasm between us. "I'll pay you back," I said, my voice cracking. "I'll find a way. I swear I'll make it right." But my father shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut me to the core. "It's not just about the money," he said quietly. "It's about trust. You can't put a price on that." I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. They came in a flood, streaming down my face as I tried to explain myself, tried to make them understand. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I sobbed. "I was scared. I thought if I told you, it would break you. I never wanted this to happen." For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the slow passage of time. My mother eventually lifted her head, her tear-streaked face pale and worn. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. "We've always done everything we could to help you," she whispered. "How could you think we wouldn't have helped you with this?" I had no answer for her. There was no excuse that could justify what I had done. I had let my fear and pride blind me, and now I was facing the consequences of my actions. "I don't know how we come back from this," my father said, his voice low and heavy with resignation. "Things aren't going to be the same." Those words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and I knew he was right. The damage had been done, and there was no way to undo it. I had shattered something fragile and precious between us, something that might never be fully repaired. But despite the pain, despite the hurt I had caused, my parents didn't walk away. They didn't disown me or tell me to leave. They stayed, though the atmosphere was thick with tension and heartbreak. "I'll give you whatever time you need to pay us back," my father finally said, his tone hard but controlled. "But more than that, you're going to have to earn back our trust. That's not something that happens overnight." "I will," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes." The room fell silent again, and I realized that while this conversation wasn't going to heal everything, it was the first step. The road ahead was long, and the wound I had inflicted on my family would take time to heal. But for the first time in months, I felt a sliver of hope. I had taken responsibility for what I had done, and now, I had the chance to rebuild what I had broken. It wasn't going to be easy. But as I looked at my parents, tired, hurt, but still there, I knew I wasn't alone in trying. The days after my confession were the hardest of my life. The house felt different, quieter, heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding on to the pain I had caused. My parents still talked to me, but the warmth, the ease of our conversations, had vanished. Every word felt cautious, measured. The trust one had shattered was like a bridge burned down, and I knew it would take a long time to rebuild. I threw myself into fixing what I had done. I worked extra shifts, took on side jobs, anything I could do to make enough money to start paying them back. Every cent I earned went straight to them. My father, always practical, accepted the payments without a word. But my mother, she struggled to even look at me sometimes, and that hurt more than anything. At night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by what I had done. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the people I had hurt, the people who had loved and trusted me unconditionally. I had betrayed them, and now, even though I was trying to make things right, I couldn't shake the feeling that I would never fully deserve their forgiveness. One evening, a few weeks after I had come clean, I came home late from a double shift. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, his usual spot, with a cup of coffee in front of him. He didn't say anything as I walked in, but he glanced up, his eyes catching mine for a moment before he looked away again. "I left the money on the counter," I said quietly, not expecting much of a response. It had become part of my routine: work, earn, pay. There wasn't much more to say. But tonight, my father surprised me. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I hesitated for a second before pulling out the chair and sitting down. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, but I could tell something had shifted. "You've been working hard," he said after a long pause, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I see that." "I'm trying," I replied, unsure of where this conversation was going. "I want to fix this." He nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "You can't fix everything with money, you know." I swallowed, my throat tight. "I know. I just don't know how else to make it right." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "It's not about the money, son. It never was. What you did, it broke something between us. But the fact that you came clean, the fact that you're trying, that means something. It'll take time, but we'll get there." I felt a lump rise in my throat, a mixture of relief and shame swirling inside me. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. My father leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. "Maybe not right away," he said. "But forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about moving forward. We've all made mistakes. What matters is what you do next." I didn't know what to say. For the first time in months, I felt like there was a way forward, like maybe I hadn't lost everything after all. The real test came the next day when I sat down with my mother. She had been the hardest to face, her hurt more profound, her silence more piercing than anything else. I found her in the living room, folding laundry, her face drawn and tired. "Mom, can we talk?" I asked, my voice tentative. She glanced up at me, her expression guarded. "What is there to talk about?" I swallowed hard. I just want you to know how sorry I am. I know I've hurt you. And I know it's going to take time, but I'm not going to stop trying to make things right." For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just kept folding the laundry, her hands moving mechanically, as if she didn't want to acknowledge the conversation. But then, slowly, she set the clothes down and looked at me, her eyes soft but still filled with pain. "I've always believed in you," she said quietly. "Even when things were tough, I never doubted that you would find your way. But this, what you did, it hurt me in a way I can't explain." "I know," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And I hate myself for it. I never wanted to hurt you." She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know how to move past this. I don't know how to look at you the same way." Her words cut deep, but I didn't flinch. "I deserved them. I'm not asking you to forget what I did," I said. "I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I can be better." For the first time in what felt like forever, she reached out and took my hand. Her grip was light, tentative, but it was enough. "I love you," she said softly. "I'll always love you. But it's going to take time. We need time." I nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I'll give you all the time you need." From that moment on, things didn't magically go back to the way they were. There were still moments of tension, still lingering doubts. But there was also progress, however slow. My father started talking to me more, not just about work or money, but about life, about the things that mattered. My mother still kept her distance at times, but I could see the small signs of thawing, the glimmers of hope that maybe, one day, we'd be a family again. Months passed, and little by little, the cracks began to heal. The money I had stolen was eventually repaid, but more importantly, I had started to repay the trust one had broken. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wondered if we would ever fully recover. But with every step forward, no matter how small, I knew I was on the right path. In the end, the lesson I learned wasn't just about making amends for what I had done. It was about realizing that the bonds we share with the people we love are fragile, but they can be mended. And even when we fall, even when we fail, it's the effort to rise again that defines who we are. Months had passed since my confession, and while things had improved, the weight of what I had done still hung over our family like a shadow. Every time I sat down to dinner with my parents, or walked through the house, I felt it, the lingering tension, the unsaid things. We were healing, but the scars remained, visible in the cautious way my mother spoke to me, in the quiet resolve of my father. I had paid back every cent of the money I'd stolen, but as my father had said, it was never really about the money. It was about the betrayal, the breaking of trust, and I had come to accept that some wounds take time, maybe even a lifetime, to fully heal. I had made a point of staying close, of being there for my parents in ways I hadn't been before. I took on more responsibilities around the house, helped with their bills, ran errands, and did whatever I could to show them I wasn't the selfish son who had taken advantage of their kindness. Slowly, they began to trust me again. It wasn't spoken aloud, but there were signs, my mother asking for my help with things she would have done herself just months before, my father occasionally sharing bits of his day with me over breakfast. It was subtle, but it meant everything. Still, I knew there was one final step I needed to take to fully repair what I had broken. It was something I had been avoiding for a long time, out of fear, out of shame. But it had to be done. One evening, after finishing a long shift at work, I knocked on the door to my parents' bedroom. My father was reading the paper, and my mother was folding clothes. They both looked up when they saw me standing in the doorway, and for a moment, I hesitated. But I couldn't back down now. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. My father set down the paper, and my mother paused in her task. They exchanged a glance before nodding, and I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. This was it, the moment I had been dreading, but also the one I knew would be my last chance to truly make things right. "I know I've already apologized," I began, standing before them like I was about to give some kind of formal speech. "And I know I've tried to make up for what I did. But there's one thing I haven't said yet, something I should have said a long time ago." My parents were silent, waiting. "I've been scared," I admitted, my hands twisting nervously in front of me. "Scared that no matter what I do, I'll never be able to make things right. I've been afraid that I'll always be the son who betrayed you, and that no matter how hard I try, that's all you'll ever see when you look at me." I paused, swallowing hard. "But I've realized something. I can't control how you see me. I can only control what I do from here on out. And what I want you to know, more than anything, is that I'm not that person anymore. I'm not the person who stole from you, who lied to you. I'm someone who has learned from his mistakes, someone who's trying, every day, to be better." My mother's eyes were glistening with tears, and my father's expression was unreadable. But I kept going, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm asking you both," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "not just to forgive me, but to give me a chance to prove that I've changed. I know I can't erase what I did, but I'm not going to stop trying to be the son you deserve." For a moment, the room was filled with a heavy silence. My parents looked at each other, then back at me. My heart was in my throat, waiting for their response. It was my mother who spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "We've always loved you," she said, her eyes locked onto mine. "That's never changed. But what you did hurt us, deeply. And it's taken time for us to process that, to understand it. But, we see how hard you've been working, how much you've changed." She reached out and took my hand, her grip warm and reassuring. "I forgive you," she whispered, tears spilling over her cheeks. "It'll take time for things to feel normal again, but I forgive you." My father, always the stoic one, cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "You've earned back our trust," he said simply, but the weight of those words hit me like a ton of bricks. "It'll take time, but we'll get there." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a flood of relief washing over me. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders, one I had been carrying for far too long. "I won't let you down again," I promised, my voice thick with emotion. "I swear." My father nodded, and my mother squeezed my hand one more time before letting go. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable like before. It was filled with something new, something closer to peace. In the weeks that followed, things didn't magically go back to normal. But there was a lightness to our interactions now, a sense that we were moving forward, not stuck in the past. We talked more, laughed more. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the way things used to be, before the lies, before the theft. And in those moments, I allowed myself to hope. As time passed, I realized that rebuilding trust wasn't just about making up for the wrongs I had done. It was about becoming someone better, someone worthy of the love and forgiveness my parents had shown me. It was about being there for them, not because I was trying to make amends, but because I wanted to. Because they deserved it. One evening, months after that final conversation, my father called me into the living room. I had been out working late, as usual, and hadn't expected much when I walked in. "Sit down," he said, and I obeyed, taking a seat on the couch across from him. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone serious, "about everything that's happened, about the work you've put in to make things right. And I want you to know something." I sat up straighter, listening intently. "You're my son," he said, his voice gruff. "And I'm proud of you." Those words, simple as they were, hit me harder than anything else he could have said. I blinked, trying to process what he had just told me. For so long, I had been chasing forgiveness, chasing redemption. But here it was, handed to me without fanfare, without conditions. Just pride. "Thank you," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. He nodded, and that was it. No grand gestures, no tearful embraces. Just a quiet moment of understanding between a father and his son. A moment that, for me, meant everything. I had made mistakes, terrible, hurtful mistakes. But I had also grown, learned, and earned back the trust one had lost. And now, as I looked at my parents, I knew that while the road to forgiveness had been long and hard, it had been worth it. In the end, it wasn't just about fixing what I had broken. It was about becoming the person they had always believed I could be, the person I had doubted I could become. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path.